Hey Lisa, how are you today?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm good. I guess I didn't say the thing I usually say first. Welcome back to another episode of the What's Your Grief podcast. I assume you know where you are if you clicked on this podcast.
Oh, I thought you were talking to me, and I was
Oh
like, I
no,
do,
do
I
you
do,
know where you are right now?
I do know where I am. I am alert and oriented times three, times
Okay,
four. How many ways are you supposed to be alert and oriented? I forget.
I
Um,
don't know now.
yeah,
I'm gonna have to Google that.
yeah, but yeah, I'm here. I know that I'm with you on the podcast. I'm feeling confident.
Okay. All right, good. Well, that's step one. Check. So for today, we normally come to you with a really brilliant and insightful podcast topic. And I wouldn't call it brilliant and insightful. It's more like a question. What we want to talk about today is a question for our listeners about the podcast, right?
Yeah, I think it's the question. I mean, I think it points to the question that we have been asking each other, which is, what do people want from this podcast? Like, what are we doing? What are we doing here?
Yeah, I'll give you a little context to how we arrived here today. So, we were talking about what we wanted to talk about today, right? And I think over the history of this podcast, which dates back like pretty far actually.
Yeah.
We've taken a lot of different approaches, and we're not saying we're going to like change up our approach or anything necessarily, but we were just kind of like wondering which of the types of approaches we've taken are the ones that people want to hear. And granted, like different listeners want to hear different things, but I think when we started this podcast, we were like, all right, we got to be really informative. We got to dive into certain topics and explain them and help listeners walk away with like a good understanding of a new concept or idea or way of thinking about things. Would you agree that that's kind of where we started?
Yeah, yeah, or if not that, like some tips for approaching things that are hard, or for, that they can like really put into practice.
Right, like like constructive takeaways, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
And I think then, we had a little bit of a chapter where we were more in the middle. We wanted to talk about some of like what's going on in the world, maybe pop culture type of things like grief in movies and TV, and maybe some more conversational stuff, but still very heavy on the takeaways. And I feel like where we've ended up recently is just a lot more kind of conversational stuff about, I feel like it's getting a little more abstract in a way, less about the takeaways and informing people, though we do try and do that stuff, kind of like psychoeducation stuff. But I do feel like lately we've done a lot of more conversational type of podcasts where we just talk about how we are thinking about things related to grief, maybe themes that we've seen come up, maybe things that are happening around us, and a lot of times about just our own grief experiences.
Yes. Yeah, I think that definitely covered, and the winter. We've talked a lot about the winter.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that that's been a lot. It's like been more of what are the things that we've been thinking about personally, with intersections of personally and professionally, but I think that has been a big piece of it. It has felt a little bit more abstract lately, and maybe a little less, yeah, less worried about, do we have to have concrete takeaways for people to walk away from the episode with, and
Yeah.
we've let that go a little bit.
Right. And that leads us to where we are today, because we were talking about the types of things that we could talk about. And, Leets and I, we talk a lot, and sometimes we go on rants about certain things. Sometimes we just have conversations about trying to understand different ways of thinking about grief and concepts, things like that. And so we were like, what do people actually want to get from this? Like, what are our listeners really interested in? Because as I was saying to you, Lisa, like, I think lately a lot of the podcasts that I listen to, I kind of just want to hear people talk who I'm interested in hearing talk. And sometimes I want to hear them kind of like say things out loud that I've been thinking, or like kind of helping me to like formulate further an opinion, or maybe even just echoing my opinion. So I know I'm like not the only one thinking it. To be like totally transparent, I'm talking about podcasts right now, not like grief support, mental health type of learning, because I've been listening to so many pop culture podcasts. I am fully immersed in the Vanderpump Rules scandal. I've listened to like 12 podcasts about it. So full disclosure there.
Meanwhile, I have absolutely no idea what you're even referencing right now. So clearly, I'm
Oh,
completely
wow.
in a different podcast universe.
Where have you been? It's like,
Either under a rock. I'm under a rock, I guess.
Well, I tried to explain it to my husband last night as we were watching Vanderpump Rules, and I'm like, never mind, I can't. This is too. There's so many podcasts. If you want to get up
Yeah.
to speed, there are so. I'll send you some links.
I'll send
Okay.
you some links. You can get caught up on your commute.
I promise you, plenty of our listeners know exactly what I'm talking about right now. Anybody who watches Bravo knows exactly what I'm talking about right now. So anyways, that's how I feel about podcasts. Now with regards to like grief support and mental health stuff, it's a little bit different, but I want to put it to you. What do you love to get out of podcasts? Or do you have, I know you listen to more podcasts than I do, so maybe you have a lot of different objectives that you want to hit.
I do. I do think I have a lot of different objectives. And I think that interestingly, part of the reason I struggle or why I've always felt like having takeaways felt important or I don't know, something like that is that for a long time, the idea that anybody would just come onto this podcast to want to listen to us like randomly chat about something like
Yeah.
that feels like very hard for me to imagine that that's a thing.
Yeah, as I was saying that that's something I like in podcasts, I was thinking in my head, but who would want to listen to us?
Well, right. No, that's exactly what I was thinking. Because I do think that one of the things that I really do love about podcasts, there's a number of podcasts I like that are a format of just, two hosts who are or two or more different hosts who are talking to each other. And what I love is also, yeah, just listening to them talk about whatever sometimes. I like the familiarity of it, and I know that that's, like, weird, but I do think it's maybe slightly a product of the fact that I live alone, and I listen to podcasts a lot.
Right.
Part of the reason I don't know the Bravo scandals, like, I don't have cable like, I don't have Bravo, um, and so I feel not that I don't watch TV, I love some TV, but I I watch mostly, like, specific Netflix type of things, and, so I do listen to podcasts a lot, and I like the familiarity of, like, I tune in and I'm like, "Oh, I don't know these people, but I know these people, and they're just talking about stuff they're interested in talking about, and I'm, interested in hearing them talk about that." So I do think that that serves a big purpose for podcasts for me. I also love a form of podcast that will never be what we do, which is like a storytelling podcast. Like I love like deep dive storytelling podcasts, like, heavyweight or ones that are really kind of getting, yeah, into
Highly
people and yeah, highly produced storytelling podcasts. That's never going to be us. Um, so we don't have to worry about that. But yeah, that's kind of what
Yeah.
podcasts serve for me. And I do listen to informational podcasts too. So I should say that. Like I do listen to certain podcasts to like I listen to it. There's a financial podcast that I listen to that I find
Mhm.
helpful for like certain things where I'm like, wow, I really don't know anything about this topic.
Right.
Can is there somebody doing a podcast that can help me break it down? Interestingly, I don't listen to I listen to very few grief and mental health podcasts. I think I struggle with them. And so I think that's part of also what makes me unsure of why people listen to our podcast because I, it's like you can't assess your own thing very accurately. And then when I listen to other grief podcasts, I'm like, this isn't, and like some of them are wonderful. Like I appreciate that the content is wonderful and helpful, but like it doesn't do it for me in the way that other podcasts do. And maybe that's just because it's like I'm doing grief things all the time. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard to say.
I'm the same way. I think part of it is definitely that thing where it's like podcasts are sort of so you can like tune out while you're like doing the dishes or whatever it is
Right.
or in the car, and grief is your work, right? And I can imagine people who are grieving often feel the same way, like, oh, I can't take a grief podcast right now because I'm spending so much time like just focused on my own grief stuff. It's hard for me to listen to this right now. So I can
Yeah.
imagine where that would be true for a lot of people. Like if it's something that's consuming your every day, it's hard to then have it playing when it's like your tune out time. So I totally could see that. Totally could.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of the thing about this podcast that I I wonder slash worry about. Like recently, I feel like more people have sent kind messages about the podcast lately than ever. And interestingly, it is a time where I feel a little bit more like, well, I don't know, like we're not giving them takeaways. Does somebody really who's grieving themselves really want to tune in to listen to two people musing about grief? I don't know. That
Well,
feels I feel unsure, but yet also I'm like, well, people are sending nice messages and that doesn't I that's interesting.
I do think that for me, so I'm thinking about where would what I want from grief support meet a podcast. And I do think like learning about a new thing is always my go-to. I think that you and I are
Mhm.
similar in that way. Like we want to learn new things about grief a lot, like
Yes.
and about some other concepts that are related to maybe psychology, stuff like that. So I do think that that is one thing, but I think if it's not that, I do think listening to a conversation that would help me to really formulate how I feel or how I look at my own experience is something that would resonate with me if I
Yeah.
like listening to those people talk. That's like a big hurdle there, right? And so I think those are the things like when you're talking about your own grief experience and your relationship with grief, I think sometimes just having new perspectives can be helpful. So that's kind of where I
Yeah.
would see like an overlap being for me if I in terms of like what I would want to kind of consume.
Yeah, that's interesting because, one of the things that we've done some episodes on lately and that we've always done over time, just sporadically here and there, is episodes that are when people listeners send us questions.
Yeah,
And then we've done things where, answering questions. And that's an interesting space because sometimes if we get questions that are so specific, and occasionally I'll feel like, wow, this is like, should we record about this when it's such a specific thing that it's only going to apply to like this super small subset of people, of listeners?
hmm,
But as you were describing that, it's interesting because I think sometimes even when we're talking about a situation that might feel very specific and limited to someone grieving, I'm thinking of some other podcasts that I listen to that take that format where, um, it's responding to something from a reader, and oftentimes, even if you don't relate to it at all, there is still something that
yeah,
they're talking about that is relevant to you and that you pull back to your own experience and that helps you to think about and clarify something for yourself. And so I do wonder if that, one of my questions is like, do people like that? Like us responding directly to or listener questions?
yeah.
Or does it feel like, oh, now I have to listen to some other
I,
griever whose experience
yeah,
has nothing to do with mine? I don't know.
I could see it going either way. Like, and again, it could depend on the day for you, But I could see it being like, oh, I definitely want to listen to this, or I want to skip this topic. I could see that. I do that all the time.
Yes.
So I could see it going either way. But yeah, I think that questions are a good way just to like know other people are going through some of the similar things or very different things in this
Yeah.
experience you're talking about like how to approach those different things. I think you can find insight from even questions that seem different than your own experience, but also of course when they are the same as your experience. So
Right.
and we are always open to those types of sessions with
Oh,
sessions
yeah.
um
Episodes, the
episodes. Yeah, what do you think
questions.
sessions?
Really taking it to mental health,
Yeah.
taking it to the
Um,
mental health place.
so I think the other one that we don't do and that
Mhm.
I don't gravitate towards when you talked about not listening to other podcasts is the interview format.
Yeah.
And we do get a lot of people messaging us about being
Oh, man.
guests. And I am curious to know if our listeners would want that format. Not necessarily 100% of the time, but would be interested. Lisa and I have talked about this a lot. And I think that we both agree that if we were to do a guest route, it would more so, I think, correct me if you disagree now, be that we would have a topic that we would all talk about, less so than us just interviewing a person about their experience.
Yes, I think definitely. Like I also, you know, don't get me wrong. There is an interview format that I like, but
Right.
it's like Fresh Air with Terry Gross interviewing someone famous. It's not like I like a very particular type of interview format, and I don't like it's not something that I feel like for us is that I'm interested in doing in this
No.
space. But I do think that there's like lots of amazing people who we know or don't know, who are also interested in grief, who, have thoughts about grief, who've done things in this space that are both like and not like what we do. And I do love the idea of being able to maybe talk with people sometimes, like literally just have them join in for the conversation. So yeah, we've kind of like that's the idea that I think has resonated the most. I think the other thing that's hard about, the interview format, like people reach out to us so often about this, and I can't criticize this format because obviously we put out a book last year and we went on other people's podcasts to talk about it. But one of the things that's hard is that oftentimes, when people pitch to be interviewed on your podcast, it's like there's a it almost limits what the conversation is going to have to be about
Mhm.
because they have a reason, like, oh, they've just made a documentary or they have a book out or it's something like very targeted and specific. So then all of a sudden it defines kind of what the episode is going to be about. It doesn't become what feels like it would resonate most with our readers or I mean our listeners. God, it's so hard that in many situations we have readers and in some situations we have listeners. I think that is the piece of it that I don't love. Like, I love the idea of, oh, this is an interesting person who's also thinking about grief. Like, let's just talk, but
Right.
not like let's have to narrow focus on whatever it is that they happened
Yes,
to have done something about.
exactly. And we're not like seasoned interviewers. We're not able to read people's books in order to interview them thoughtfully. So I think that's part of it for us as well.
Yeah, I know. We don't have time. I mean, that's part of it. It's like you get these requests and it's like, oh, this looks interesting. Maybe, but it's only a fraction of the things that we're able to review in terms of interviews or movies or shows or whatever. I do sort of miss, on an unrelated note, our slightly more pop culture episodes. We haven't done one of those in a while.
I know we can because there's some stuff out there that I think we could watch.
Shrinking.
We can definitely do that in the future.
Yeah.
Well, what if we created a little survey and put it in the notes for the
Oh
show?
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah.
And so we will keep it really simple where I think maybe we could have like, and you don't have to select one. We want to hear just like where people's preferences lie.
Hmm.
Um, for podcasts like this in general, I think one of them would be, just that psychoeducational stuff, like I want the takeaways, give me the takeaways. One
Yep.
would be kind of like listening to conversations about concepts and thoughts. I don't know how we would frame that, but
Yeah.
what we talked about that. I think one could be like the question and answer format,
Yep.
and one could be having guest hosts
Mhm.
and just see where people say their interests lie. Because in
Yeah.
the end, like we want you all to get something from this.
Yeah.
And like you said, I think it's hard for us to really assess what is helpful to people, and
Yeah.
full disclosure, like we hope you leave us good reviews, but we don't read the podcast reviews.
No, we were already hurt so deeply by podcast reviews, like our that we just cut ourselves off from listening to them because
The,
I know I have vocal fry and you don't need to tell me in a
the,
review.
the funny thing about the podcast reviews is that, well, like we mentioned this recently. We started this podcast, I think in did we say
14.
2014?
Hmm.
And it's never been like, I guess, rocket science to create a podcast, but at the time it was harder. It was a lot harder. And so our setup, our situation, it was a lot more rudimentary. And so we have a lot of, I think, reviews from that time that were this production is bad, which
Yeah.
yes, it definitely was. And it's not exactly like stellar now, but podcasting has become a lot easier to be passable, right? And I think our
Yeah.
standards for podcasts have changed a little bit. Like at the time, I think the gold standard was like Serial, right? We're never going to be Serial, you know? And so I do think that things have changed a little bit, but we keep moving forward with the reviews that were left in 2014. And I have definitely been tempted to be like, let's just start over.
No, it's so true. Like, I feel so sad. I'm like, oh, like it looks like our podcast is not very good because those reviews from
Yeah.
2014 and how bad our sound quality was like
I mean,
dominate.
and that's
And
not
it
the
was
I'm
never,
sure that's not the only reason anybody ever left us a negative
oh
review, and
no.
that's okay,
But
but
those are the ones that were like the 1 star, like, it was just the, like,
yeah.
the really mean ones that took the average down. So, yeah, we just did the smart thing for our own mental health and well-being, which is that we stopped r reading our reviews because otherwise we would have had to stop recording this podcast. So,
Right, right, and
yes.
so I unfortunately, I think that's, that's that thing where if you avoid the thing that's gonna be painful, you cut yourself off from potentially getting the benefit of somebody who might have left you a nice positive review, but I'm sorry, our self-esteem cannot handle it.
Oh, but we really appreciate when you all send a nice message. No, it does make a big difference. And that's part of, yeah, why we just want to know more. And we'll definitely put like a comment box on that
Mhm.
survey for if you have suggestions of topics, things you would love to hear us talk about, whether that just be between each other or with somebody else. And if you have any questions, we'll put that in there.
Yeah,
So
yeah, please
um
fill it out.
well, I was just gonna say, how about we'll also maybe put an optional space in there where if you it'll be an anonymous survey, but if you want to put your information in there, we'll make it a contest. We'll give a copy of our book. We'll
Oh,
do a drawing, right?
sounds good,
Yes.
yeah, and if you already have
Yes.
our book, we'll find some other way to make you happy.
We'll give you a membership to our community
Yeah,
and
how about
if
both? Let's just give them both,
or both. Yes. We'll do both. And you can always regift the book.
but not the community. Well, I guess you could
You
re-gift the
can regift the community. Yeah, we'll do yes, we'll say a year in the community.
yeah. All right, good
All
idea.
right. All right, there we go. So if you needed any more incentive, there it is.
All right, wow. Thank you for sticking with us through this conversation about the podcast. It's a very meta podcast about the podcast. Is that I never know if I'm using the word meta right. That's
Yeah,
meta,
yeah.
right? Okay.
That's meta.
Uh and we do hope that you will fill out the survey. Again, it's anonymous. But if you leave your information, we'll give you instructions how to give us your information. And we will enter it into a drawing. Let's say we'll leave it open for maybe a couple weeks.
Let's see. I'll pick a date right now. How about until March the 25th?
Sounds good. All
All
right.
right.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye everyone.